teach-ins, you'll know that these are all recorded. I will send you a recording follow-up tomorrow via email. And for those that might not be able to attend, this is a way that they can refresh and review the information presented in tonight's teach-in. So, first of all, I will introduce myself again. Some might be familiar with me if you've attended the previous sessions. If you're new, welcome. So, Sigali Swagweg, Yegon Sioni'i. So, hello everyone. My name is Yegon Si. I am the executive director at a 501c3 nonprofit organization in the Oneida community in Wisconsin, and that organization is called Scotney Gulat. And Scotney Gulat essentially means one mind. It is an organization that supports the resurgence of Oneida language and culture through language medium education as a way to heal our community. So this is tonight's third teach-in in our teach-in series, our virtual teach-in series. And tonight's discussion is about blood quantum. And specifically, it's a colonial designed prescription of indigeneity. So we'll look into some historical roots. We will look into the cultural roots of what our ideas of belonging, of community, of identity were within a cultural perspective, but also give a lot of history to understand truly what blood quantum is, when it was introduced, and the intentions behind it. So again, welcome to tonight's teach-in. I'm glad you were all able to join us. I'm going to continue on. So Sugali, hello everyone. So as we always start each teach-in, we want to frame this series or frame the fire, and welcome and kind of have a little grounding before we begin. And so I've asked this same question and same idea at the previous teach-ins because it might change from time to time. And so we acknowledge that this cultural metaphor of what we call Yungwa Jistai in the Oneida language, which really means this fire that we have within us. And when we say fire, that means our life force, our energy, our spirit, and this is captured within each of our beings, our physical being, but also within our spiritual selves. And so this idea of fire truly means something inside, spiritual, and is a powerful, energetic life force. And so they say within our culture that we have four logs. There's four inherent logs that are necessary to kindle and maintain this strong fire. And those four logs, if you look on the left of the screen, you'll notice that these logs are what we call consciousness, concatenation, curiosity, and creativity. And so consciousness is really being aware of our motives. It's being aware of our intentions. It's having this idea of self-awareness, but external awareness and how we are in relationship with the natural world and with creation. The next one is curiosity. And so it's being able to be open to discovery, learning about different things, developing an understanding or a deeper awareness of different concepts, especially a lot of the concepts we talk about here in the teach-in series. And one thing I'll note is that all of these inherent logs, they all work together and they are all part of our life force, our energy. The third one is called concatenation, and that's really this link to all beings. Everything in the natural world, we understand that there's a relationship to everything that exists within creation, within the natural world. And the last one we understand to be creativity. And so this also goes along with the previous logs. It's being able to make connections and understanding that those connections are based on what we understand to be relationships, that they're also reciprocal in nature, or what we might understand to be a mutually beneficial relationship. And so this teaching series really seeks to tend to these four logs that we have within each of us that we're born with. And it's a way to strengthen our fires. It's a way to strengthen our being, our understanding, our consciousness, our curiosity, concatenation, and creativity. So in the chat, I want you to share what log you want to tend to today. So I will pull up the chat and read off of them. Again, if you want to continue and sit and reflect on these logs, please feel free to do so. If you would like to share, you can also share that in the chat, and I will share that with the group. So tonight I am going to explore and tend to the log of consciousness. I think this particular topic about blood quantum has a lot of historical roots. And so, what we really want to understand is what is the framework that we're operating within currently in tribal communities today? And how is blood quantum related to ideas of land? How is it related to ideas of sovereignty and self-determination? And it's kind of bridging together, I suppose you could say, consciousness, but also that log of concatenation. And so it's understanding these links between each of these different aspects that are related to blood quantum. So it looks like a few of you have shared in the chat. One is curiosity, another curiosity, lots of curiosity. Concatenation, yep. So it's hard to also pick just one because they really develop our inner spirit. So continue to feel free to share in the chat. I'm gonna keep moving along just because we do have a lot of information to go through and I don't want to keep you over time. So I want to really be mindful of everyone's time. And I really appreciate the time that we share together and being able to join and learn and extend that log of curiosity. Okay, so as always, within all of our teach-ins, it's always a good reminder to remind ourselves of the community agreements that we commit to. So you all agree to these on your registration, but I want to also share them as a reminder so that we can renew these commitments as we move through this space. So our first community agreement is really active listening. We're listening to learn, to understand, not necessarily to respond. That log of curiosity is a part of our community agreement. And so staying curious, being curious, open to learning, speaking from your own experience. So using I statements to share your personal experiences and also avoid generalizations. We always want to respect confidentiality, especially when we come into a shared space. And so that's another one of our community agreements. We also want to extend this practice of both and. So we know that it's not always either or, like the characteristics of white supremacy culture tell us, which I will remind us of shortly. But really, that two things can coexist, or two perspectives, or two ideas, or experiences that might be quite opposite can both coexist at the same time. Okay? We also want to make sure we remind ourselves of this idea of understanding our intention versus impact. And so sometimes what we intend might not necessarily be the impact. And so we take that time to acknowledge maybe impacts that might not land very well. We also want to extend being a good relative to everyone in a shared space, and we want to ensure that right to safety, peace, harmony, and honesty, and also practicing these four R's, which again are respect, relationships, reciprocity, and responsibility. And I always like to add the invisible fifth R, which is resilience, because as Indigenous people, we know that that is a core part of our being as well. We also want to remember why we're here, and I always share the purpose of the teach-in, which I'll do shortly, because it's mission driven. We're coming together to, just like the name of the organization is, Scotney Gulet, to extend this idea of one mind, of being together, of understanding that there's a shared mission here in trying to understand these colonial frameworks that have created this notion of blood quantum that impacts our communities today. So we want to stay mission driven. We want to focus on community and collaboration towards this shared understanding. The next one is the power of the parking lot. Sometimes we share things, sometimes we have ideas or make recommendations, and we might not always get to them, and that's okay because we want to make sure that we allow for time and space to renew or revisit or recommit to ideas, discussions, tasks if we're working collaboratively. And so sometimes we might just kind of put things in the parking lot to revisit later. And then the last one is just being on time. We're being mindful of everyone's time in this shared space here today. So these are some of our community agreements because they help us build and sustain healthy and peaceful relationships and also dismantle colonial based toxic behaviors that contradict our Indigenous values. So again, what are those behaviors? And I always share this because it's so important to name these things. Part of our teach-in series is really to educate or re-educate community on our cultural values. But before we can really do that, we have to understand or take steps to decolonize. So I always say, like, language and cultural reclamation is almost a journey, partially that is involving decolonization, and it transitions into a step of re-indigenization. And to decolonize, we have to name and acknowledge behaviors, values, things that come up within our communities. And the best way that we can describe this is what we call characteristics of white supremacy culture. Sometimes it's called colonial culture, behaviors of colonization. And so there's essentially about 15 different characteristics that capture that idea of white supremacy culture. And those, again, are perfectionism, the sense of urgency, it's always tied to time, the idea of defensiveness. And if you are just joining us now, our previous teach-ins on our YouTube channel have all of these characteristics. We go over these extensively in Teach-In 2 when we talked about community. But I always remind everyone of these characteristics just because it's good to revisit them as we renew our shared space and time with each other. The rest of them include quantity over quality. We will really focus on that one tonight. The worship of the written word, we see this especially pertinent in language revitalization because we know that those are oral histories. And all of these topics are really related. And so we really see how these characteristics impact our communities. This idea of only one right way. The notion of the patriarchy or paternalism is very common. This idea of either or thinking, the idea of power hoarding or a hierarchy, the fear of open conflict, this idea of individualism, which is also really important in the discussion of blood quantum. So we'll notice that quantity over quality and the idea of individualism are pretty apparent when we talk about impacts of blood quantum in our communities today. The next one, I'm the only one. Progress, which can be assumed as bigger or more in white supremacy ideology, the idea of objectivity, and also this last one about the right to comfort. So we really understand that our indigenous communities are essentially outcomes of colonization, and we have also indoctrinated ourselves and adopted these as part of our community practices, our organizational practices, and our protocol. So another part of the reason why we do these teach-ins is to really build awareness to enact systemic and social change. Um, and so, just a brief reminder is these characteristics of white supremacy culture are really rooted on a few different pillars. One is racism, classism, capitalism, patriarchy, and Christianity. And so, these pillars really uphold that system, and it's a way to legitimize extraction, exploitation, and eradication in pursuit of power, control, and greed. And that statement is really important in understanding the intentions behind the system of blood quantum, which is really related to the teaching that we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm not going to do the breakout room discussion. I keep intending to do it, so I think we'll just have to do the sharing in the chat, just so I'm mindful of the time. But if you feel inclined to share or would like to share, please share how you see these characteristics show up in discussions of blood quantum, or how do these influence blood quantum? So I mentioned a couple already to kind of get your minds going, get the gears turning, and we can kind of start to open our minds to understanding how does white supremacy ideology influence, motivate blood quantum, and how does that impact our communities today? So feel free to share in the chat. I will pull that up here and read a few um, that are shared here. So it looks like um it looks like oh, from the last question, creativity. So yeah. Um Perfectionism, not Indian enough. Definitely. That is really key to uh aspect of blood quantum that we see show up in our community. I mentioned the idea of quantity over quality. And so when we think about blood quantum, the way in which it operates is through a measurement, a quantifiable measurement, which we know for many tribes is 1/4, which basically dictates the membership in a given community. And so that notion of quantifiable measurements is pretty influential in blood quantum. So if anyone would like to share anything, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'll check it throughout the teach-in. And I also want to continue to be mindful of time, so I think I will continue on, but you are more than welcome to continue to share in the chat as well. Okay. Oh, it looks like we have one more. I'll read that before we go. American colonialism puts self-reliance on a pedestal, so individualism is heavily ingrained in our daily culture, definitely. Yes, and we will continue to explore that here in understanding how blood quantum came about. So, the purpose of this specific teach-in, and just a reminder, a teach-in is a community learning space. So, it's a gathering for action and change. And it's really to create space for learning, reflection, dialogue, and collective understanding about the issues and topics that deeply affect our people and our future. And we know that one of those topics that deeply affect Oneida community here in Wisconsin, but also all tribal nations, within present day United States really is blood quantum. It's probably one of the most pressing issues that we see today, and it's related to every other social issue that we also see within our communities. So, this teach-in space is where we share knowledge, we reflect together, and we really build a shared sense of awareness and also purpose. So, it's really to raise awareness, but also inspire critical thinking and move us towards that concrete action. And I always like to think of our teach-ins as kind of a journey. And so we're kind of here relearning, creating that reflection space and inspiring change. And that takes time. But the first step is always with education. And hopefully there is a piece of knowledge in this teaching tonight that will sit with you moving forward. So today's purpose is we really want to understand and explore the colonial origins of blood quantum. We want to understand how this shapes identity, belonging, and also how it's related to sovereignty. We also want to discuss the impacts that blood quantum has on our community today. And we also want to use this teaching as a way to inspire and reclaim Indigenous frameworks of identity, and leadership and belonging and connection with community, because all of those things are tied together. Um, so to understand blood quantum and the colonial origins of blood quantum, I think it's also really important to kind of revisit what the frameworks of community and identity were. So the second teaching I had 2 weeks ago was focused on this idea of community. So this is slightly a recap, but it presents and flows well into the third teaching tonight about blood quantum. So if you've noticed or have been attending all of them or have watched all of them on your own time, you'll notice they're all related. All of these aspects are interconnected in our community today, but they're also intentional to be able to understand how one thing affects another. It's kind of like this idea of dominoes. One thing always impacts the next um, beyond it. And so, just a brief understanding about this idea of community, ideas of Indigenous community, specifically within the Oneida perspective, and reframing and reclaiming our idea of Oneida identity is based on a few different things. So, one of those ways in which the Oneida framework of identity and community exists is based on relationship. And so, in the last teaching, I did a deep dive into this graphic on the right-hand side of your screen, which we call the web of relationality. And so we understand that our existence as an individual is based on an ecosystem of relationships. So that white supremacy culture characteristic about individualization is very disconnected from the natural world, from the planet, from creation, from the universe. And we can really see how that plays out in society, especially with issues like climate change, pressing issues like social justice, and other issues that affect our society. So, in the last teach-in, I talked about this web of relationality. And so, just a brief recap. The first teach-in, I talked deeply about this idea of Scott Gulet and how that is basically a relational alignment between all these webs of relationality. So, that means it's a connection, a balanced connection between the self and then the family or the clan and then the nation and then creation and then the universe. So, we kind of understand how we exist within the universe as a connecting concentric circle. And this is what we understand to be the ecosystem of relationships. And if you know anything about science or ecosystems, all of Western knowledge is really catching up to what we've already known as Oneida people. And it's a balance. Ecosystems maintain balance. There's all these different species and plants and factors at play that all come together to essentially create this very well balanced ecosystem. And so that's how we can understand our place in creation, in the world, in the universe. And so it's also important to be aware of other aspects when we think about our idea of self, that small seed, that small fire of ourselves within the middle of that circle. And those two aspects that are important to be aware of are the ideas of privilege and also positionality, because the way in which we exist in society is not merely disconnected from other people, but unfortunately, there is also notions of inequalities or inequities. And so sometimes the idea of self may have more access, unfortunately, in reality, to other webs of relationality. And the purpose of this teaching is to get back to that balance, get back to that idea of Scotney Gulet, because that's how we create thriving communities again. That's how we create healthy communities, balanced communities. So those things are important realities to consider when we think about the web of relationality. So we know that all of these relationships exist simultaneously and symbiotically, and they're all mutually beneficial. They're all reciprocal. If you'll notice that line under Scott Nigulet, the arrows go outward. It means it's back and forth. This idea of reciprocity is ever present in relationality or relationships. So the alignment of all of those is what we understand to be Scotney Gulet. And this is a model that we can also consider to be a top view of the upward spiral, because Scotney Gulet is essentially, it's not necessarily just a concentric circle, but it's this idea of expansion, because the circle never ends. It just continues to evolve and get wider and wider. Okay, and Teaching 2 on Scott Nigulet's YouTube channel also has the deeper dive into this web of relationality or community. But the frameworks of community and identity, like I had mentioned, is relationship. So it's our ability to maintain reciprocal relationships. That's actually one of our responsibilities as Ongwehu or Oneida people, or more broadly, Indigenous people of Turtle Island. And we know that these ideas of symbiotic relationships, that's found in the natural world, that reflects the natural world, because when we're able to express that equal balance of kind of give and take or reciprocity, that maintains balance, and that actually further creates expansive evolution. The other idea is that the quality of relationships is key. It's not about how many relationships, it's about the quality, the deep level of trust and reciprocity. And so those are two other key factors in the framework of this Oneida understanding of community and identity. The last two are related to this idea of community care and collective responsibility. So to be in relationship with community means not just being in relationship to yourself and family and clan. It means also extending to being in relationship with creation. That is also community. Because what is community? It's not just exclusive to our community here, but it's extended to the trees, to the waters, to the winds, to the moon, and every element that we give thanks to in our speeches before we gather, before we give thanks, before we have ceremony. And so it's extended to all of these aspects. Community care is reciprocal, and it's also underscored by an idea of collective responsibility. So it's my responsibility to care for creation. And in turn, creation maintains its responsibilities to care and provide nourishment, to provide water, to provide medicines, to provide foods for me or for my family or for my people. And so this idea of community care and collective responsibility, it's a living, breathing relationship that's taking place, mutually beneficial. It's also a reciprocal notion of belonging. And this is really important because when we talk about colonial understandings of blood quantum, this gives us a good foundation to understand what is ours and what is not. And so community care and collective responsibility include these ideas of kind of this give and take equally and equitably, and it flows back and forth. It's fluid. It's not static. It's not stopping, say, okay, I'll revisit this relationship later. It always exists. It's a continuum of a relationship. And it's this idea of back and forth to keep that balance. The last one, which is really important in understanding Oneida roots of belonging or community, what makes someone a part of community and identity, because identity and community are kind of like two interconnected notions. And as we move throughout tonight's teaching, that'll become more and more apparent. So, this last piece is ancestral lineage. Lineage is based on a clan system through the mother's side for Oneida people and for the Haudenosaunee people. And it's this idea of that identity is not, it's defined through connection. It's not defined through a measurement like a number or a quantifiable number. It's defined through connection, connection to land, connection to family, connection to creation, connection to traditional arts, connection to traditional songs, to language, to dances, to traditional birthing practices, to traditional governing systems, to treaties and our histories and our stories. That is how identity is defined. It's through connection to those different ways of life. And that lineage only is a marker of that. And that we get our clan through the mother's side. And this goes back to the creation story for Oneida people, where the first person, who we call Sky Woman or Ojijagayu, her name meaning mature flower, who came through Sky World, the hole in Sky World, and she, that idea of her being a matrilineal, a matriarch is where that idea of matrilineal culture comes from because she was the first person here on Turtle Island. And even at that time in the creation story, she was pregnant. And so that idea of life giving, that responsibility of life giving is connected to our lineage. And so that's why we get our line, our clan from our mother's side. But it's also important to know that in Oneida culture, there's also other ways to keep the balance because they say in our culture that the universe doesn't like a void. That means that the universe likes a balance. So if someone might not have like a line through their mother's side and it might be through their dad's side, there's also adoption processes that are culturally relevant and culturally based to bring people in to community as well. And so there's a very fluid understanding of what makes someone a part of community. And it's not tied by any racial or blood measurement of indigeneity or identity. So let's talk about the colonial frameworks of government, of governance, and how that shows up. And so I really like talking about this because I think it's so important. I also think it's pretty underrated in when we have discussions of blood quantum because we really need to understand the history that's behind blood quantum and how it came about. So the first notion where blood quantum really became a central political policy was during this time of what we call reorganization. That was approximately the 1920s to the 1940s. Throughout contact and the birth of the United States here on North America, we see the federal government enact a number of policies. It's basically how they are going to engage with tribal nations. It's their action of diplomacy, which in essence is detrimental and pretty negative in its impact on Indigenous people. And so, in this time period of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the federal government began to shift from what was called allotment and assimilation to what they coined as reorganization. And so, how did that come about? So the Indian Reorganization Act, which is also known as the IRA, that happened in 1934. That was passed by the federal government. It's also commonly known as the New Deal or the Howard Wheeler Act. And basically, this presented a framework of colonial tribal government structures. And so, what happened at that time was tribes were coerced to adopt a tribal council, which was a blanket attempt to capture the idea of collective leadership because tribes ancestrally didn't have just necessarily one leader, but it was like a group of people or representation that would interact or make decisions on behalf of a community through whatever processes they would use to select a leader. And so, oh, I think someone might have their mic on if you'd be able to mute that. So tribes were coerced to adopt a tribal council or collective leadership through democratic elections in order to gain federal recognition. And so essentially, in order to be federally recognized, tribes had to accept this. They were forced to accept the Indian Reorganization Act. Did all tribes do it? Not necessarily, but the majority of tribes did that were within what we know to be present day United States now. And so these democratic elections were some of the first intentions of installing quantifiable measurements or voting um, in terms of numbers. It wasn't a selection of leadership based on skill, based on gifts, based on systems of natural law. It was just merely almost based on a system of who got the most votes, and that was the democratic system. And so the IRA was an attempt to reverse this
It's
previous federal
1:15 and
policy of allotment
broccoli.
and assimilation. Oh, I think someone might have their mic on. I think it's Olive. Olive, I think you might have your mic on.
But just a little handful. What's that? Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Olive, would you be able to mute your mic for a little bit? Okay, so the IRA was an attempt to reverse allotment and assimilation. And why that happened was because prior to 1934, a report was done by the federal government that went into reservations and noticed the impacts of the Dawes Allotment Act. And that was prior to 1934, approximately in the 1920s. And that was a way to individualize the territory of the reservation that existed for Oneida people. And so basically, what it did was it took a communal approach to land ownership and chopped it up or made it into a checkerboard and gave a parcel to every head male over 18. And also that was a certain amount of verifiable blood. So blood quantum actually came into account during the Dawes Allotment Act period prior to 1934, but it was even formalized in the Indian Reorganization Act. So after tribal communities and reservations were chopped up using that allotment equation, that measurement, the federal government understood how detrimental that was to communities. It basically um, established poverty. It made tribes. Oh, I think someone still has their mic on. Sorry. Olive, do you have your mic on? Would you be able to mute your mic?
Think of onion? You want onion? Oh, yeah.
Oh, Olive, are you there?
Onion, bud. Let's see.
Olive, are you there? Can you hear me?
Doesn't look very good to me, but I
Let
have
me
more.
see if I can. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, it's fine.
Okay, I got it. Okay, sorry. It's helpful because sometimes there's background noise, so then it's tricky, I think, for the audience to kind of follow along. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay, so we'll continue on. So when this report came out, it measured how the detrimental impacts of allotment and assimilation, how that impacted tribal communities, poverty, um, no economy, no opportunities, and a variety of other social issues. Although the report was intended to reverse or end assimilation, it actually never ended. And so tribes, prior to adopting the Indian Reorganization Act, already had governing structures in place for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, since time immemorial, or even since the time of creation, or for the Haudenosaunee, that would be since the time of Great Law, the Great Law of Peace, which was a few thousand years. And so that's really important because generally those traditional governing systems had clan systems or a chief's council. So for Oneida people, and I'll show you here shortly, that was what we call the Grand Council of Chiefs. And so the Indian Reorganization Act basically didn't acknowledge those traditional governing structures, forced upon a template, and said, here, you need to take this And if you choose to adopt this, we're saying it's a choice, but it's really not a choice because if you don't adopt it, we're not going to give you federal recognition status. If you do adopt it, we'll give you federal recognition status and you will be somewhat in a good relationship with the federal government, but you will basically eliminate your inherent sovereignty. So, leadership in terms of an elected tribal council became defined by a colonial system. So that again was these quantifiable elections. It wasn't based on cultural continuity. It didn't acknowledge the traditional governing systems. It didn't acknowledge the inherent leadership skill sets, which were based on gifts and certain training that a leader might engage in over the course of his life. And those systems always reflected natural law. So again, these are ideas that reflect the natural world, that reflect creation. And so I like this picture because it's not specifically relevant to Oneida people. It's related to the delegates of the Confederated Tribes of the Flathead Indian Reservation. But I think it's important because the individual, the Secretary of Interior, Harold Ikes, he handed this tribe the first constitution issued under the IRA in 1935. And I thought it was really interesting because it's almost a representation of the United States to indigenous people. The United States handed them their sovereignty, it handed them their federal status. But tribes already had their sovereignty. They had their sovereignty and they had whatever status that you could consider their nationhood, however you would want to call that, they already had that. That was inherent. They did not need that or have to have that as part of the relationship with the United States. So, why is that important? Because now we enter a power dynamic of the United States and tribal nations. Prior to 1934, and a few hundred years prior to that, the initial treaties that the Haudenosaunee and the United People had with the United States were more on an equitable, equal basis. And that was through the use of wampum belts. In the last teaching, I talked about that two-row wampum and how that was a respectful relationship that the Haudenosaunee had with the Dutch and that they weren't to interfere with each other's ways of being. But now we see with policies like the Indian Reorganization Act that there was a total shift in the power dynamic. So we start to see the current reality we live in here with the United States being essentially like the older brother, we say, the power above tribal nations. Although the idea of sovereignty in theory is that they are the same, right? If the United States is a nation and the Oneidas are a nation, then they should have an equal relationship. But that's not the reality. So I just like this picture because it's basically symbolic of the United States handing over the status of tribal sovereignty to tribes, but they already had their tribal sovereignty. Okay, so a little bit more on this. The United Nation of Wisconsin formally adopted the IRA on November 14th, 1936. This established the elected governing body. So for Oneida people, it's called the Oneida Business Committee. This elected governing body further established a constitution because the IRA, policies and provisions of the IRA required tribes to not only have an elected governing body, but it required them to have a constitution. Did it say you can create your own constitution? Slightly, but the federal government actually gave template or what we call boilerplate constitutions to tribes. So it wasn't saying like, here's a blank sheet of paper, you can create whatever you want. Here's a template that we're going to give you. And again, if you don't adopt this, we're not going to give you federal recognition status. So there's a lot more to the story of the IRA that I think is presented in history. I think when we talk about this through an Indigenous perspective, we can really understand the deception and the coercion that happened in history, especially in regards to the IRA, because a lot of times it's actually framed in tribes now having sovereignty, but they've always had sovereignty, or that they have these abilities to self-determine themselves. They already had those abilities. This was a different power dynamic shift that had happened. And so these constitutions that were required in the IRA, they were presented by the federal government as a template, essentially, a boilerplate constitution. And many tribes adopted those boilerplate constitutions, those templates. And the Constitution also required the tribe to include an outline membership. So this is where the idea of blood quantum enters. The boilerplate constitutions included blood quantum or a certain quantity or fraction of how much Oneida or Native or Indian someone was as a basis for citizenship. And so when we see this, this is a shift from the ideas of white supremacy culture away from our cultural perspectives. And so it's cultural misalignment, it's disconnection to community, and we also see vague standardization across all tribes because not all tribes use this same blood quantum requirement, but a lot of them do. And that's often 1/4 Indian blood. And so for Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, it is 1/4 Indian blood at minimum to be on the enrollment for the tribe. So, thinking about that, blood quantum is a colonial concept. It was designed to assimilate, eradicate, and cause the extinction of our people. Why would the federal government do that? It's a way it's a way to really essentially take land, which is what it is. But it uses abstract and dehumanizing quantitative measurements to determine membership. So it's saying almost it's a label. It's saying, okay, well, you are 100% or you are half, and this is now how you will be known as in the community. And again, these were never our concepts. It was a concept placed on us that was not ours, a foreign concept. And so this was done to reduce, the United States did this to reduce treaty obligations and take over whatever remaining lands existed, which were very minimal already. And so it's also a way to eliminate Indigenous people because if Indigenous people are eliminated through blood quantum, then the federal government does not have to fulfill treaty and trust responsibilities and obligations. And when a people do not exist anymore, then the land is up for grabs because white supremacy culture thrives again on extraction and exploitation, gain and power. What does that mean? It's based on the pillar of capitalism. More, more, more. Progress is more. And so if we have more land, we have more money, we have more power, we have more control. All of these ideas are related to blood quantum and why it existed. It was designed to do exactly that. So the issues of blood quantum and land are directly interconnected to each other. Um, in order to get land, Indigenous people had to be eliminated, point blank. That was the design. And so the other thing that's really important because it's not just tied to land, but it's tied to sovereignty. So once a tribe adopted a elected governing body and a constitution and outlined their membership, that constitution had to be given to the United States. And they said, can you approve this constitution? Okay. So the US Secretary of Interior approves the Constitution. That is not a historical fact. That still occurs today. Approximately 10 years ago, the United Nations changed their name from Oneida Indians of Wisconsin to Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. That was a constitutional change that the nation had to undergo as an organization and a political and business entity. And what they had to do is they had to get 2/3 of the membership of Oneida to turn out to vote. They had to get 2/3 support for that name change. Once they got that name change, they were then able to draft that into the Constitution, go to the Secretary of Interior and say, can you please approve this? So, if we think about tribal sovereignty, this erodes the notion of tribal sovereignty. Because if we are truly sovereign as a nation, as a people, and act in that way, we do not have to seek acceptance or approval from outside nations or communities or people to approve of our changes that have to do with our people. So this is a significant issue and why that's present in a lot of the social issues we see in our community today, because it shifts from what we were previously as a self-sufficient nation to dependency. That is a very significant shift in how our communities operate today. Not just as a community, but again, the web of relationality. It trickles down and is connected to the South. So when the U.S. grants a tribe with federal recognition status, like they did in the IRA, it shifts them from self-sufficiency to domestic dependency. So like this picture here, okay? It's a power dynamic at play. Um, oh, my picture is not working for some reason. I think you can see it here, so I'll leave it like this. Um, colonial frameworks of governance. We went from the left side, which was our traditional governing system, which is what we call for Oneida people as part of a collective of nations in the Haudenosaunee, the Grand Council of Chiefs, which is composed of 50 chief leaderships that are matched with a clan mother and helpers that make decisions and represent the collective group of the Haudenosaunee in their traditional governing structure. And the clans, each of those, for Oneida, we actually have 9 of these strings that represent each. There's 50 strings on this circle wampum here, and Oneida has 9 that represents the original 9 clan families. And so those are each appointed with a chief leader and a clan mother that makes decisions on behalf of the nation for the collective nations for the Haudenosaunee. And this is what we call the circle wampum. It's our ancestral idea of governance. So we went from that to what we now understand, or what I like to call colonial tribal governance. And colonial tribal governance is very disconnected to these original ways of being. The interesting concept with Oneida people and the Haudenosaunee is that our 50 Council of Chiefs system, our traditional governing system, still exists. Is it recognized by the United States? Does the United States go to the Grand Council of 50 Chiefs when they want to make treaties or political actions? No, they don't. They go to this one because this is the federally recognized tribal governing system that operates and what they recognize. So the United States recognizes this. They recognize the colonial tribal governance model, which for Oneida people is the business committee. For a lot of other tribes, you might understand that to be like a tribal council. And again, these are just elected positions. They're not based on how leadership was selected, based on gifts, based on mentorship, based on training, based on a variety of skill sets, natural skill sets, which are really important and all tied to language and culture that is representative in the Grand Council of Chiefs. So this is a significant shift. Again, we see self-sufficiency within this traditional governing system. We see dependency in the other one. So I don't know if my picture will show up on here, but I'll continue to move on. So what is blood quantum? By definition, and this comes from the Native Governance Resource Center, and they say blood quantum is a concept created by white settlers that refers to the amount of so-called Indian blood that an individual possesses. So blood quantum appears as a fraction and is calculated based on an individual's family tree. It's rooted in eugenics, and eugenics is a way to cause extinction. It's a way to oppress and suppress a people. And this concept lacks any scientific basis because if you have children, the biological features are not split in half. The physiology is not split in half. It's not possible to calculate how much blood or native blood someone has. So not only is it not culturally aligned, it's also not scientifically aligned based on Western measures of science. But again, this is a political, racialized policy by the United States, and it doesn't have any justification in both science and cultural understandings. So, blood quantum is a stand-in device for lineage, and it's imposed by the federal government to disempower tribal nations, indigenous people, and to separate them from their lands, resources, culture, identities, languages, and futures. So when you disconnect them and separate them from those things, it makes it easier for the United States to exploit and extract and gain power and control over those lands and resources. But it also does another thing. It assimilates those people. It assimilates them into colonial culture, to mainstream English schooling, which is still very present today. It extracts them from land. When you extract a person, an indigenous person from land, you're disconnecting them automatically to language and culture because those two things are intertwined with the relationship to land. And ultimately it erodes their identity or what they understand to be their identity. And so when we look at our communities, we see significant social issues in terms of health. We see social issues with some of the highest rates of diabetes, heart disease, high rates of incarceration, substance abuse, whether that be alcohol or drugs, domestic violence. Why do those things happen? They are essentially cycles of trauma that have been perpetuated as a result of colonial violence. One of those ways in which colonial violence has happened is through blood quantum. Another is through boarding schools. Every single um, experience in history between the United States and indigenous people is rooted in violence and it's rooted in trauma. And so the social issues that exist, like poverty and incarceration, substance abuse, those are outcomes and outputs of trauma and violence, colonial violence. And it's important to name that and understand the connection between all of those. So why does blood quantum fail us? So again, from the Native Government Resource Center, they say 70% of federally recognized Native nations that share geography with the United States, they use blood quantum as a metric for citizenship. Most of them use 1/4. And again, that was presented as a boilerplate constitution to tribes. They didn't just say, oh, 1/4 sounds good. Okay. It was a template coerced to them for them to gain federal recognition status. But they already had that. That's the other thing. So, a little bit more of why it fails us. Data and how much, because when we look at especially the Oneida tribe, there's lots of initiatives in the community going on right now and discussions happening about what is the projection of our population, of our numbers now into the future. So the data for Oneida shows a declining amount of our population. And they also say that 9 out of 10 Oneidas are not reproducing with other Oneidas. And so that boils our identity or blood quantum down to this idea of data, of numbers. But we aren't numbers. It doesn't tell our story. It doesn't tell our story of connection or relationship and citizenship to a nation, because that's again based on community and identity. So it's presenting again this idea of a quantifiable measurement to and equating it with a quality understanding of our connections to community. It's also incredibly dehumanizing and devaluing. So if you're familiar with blood quantum, there's no other race of people that have a card that represents their status, their native status, or how much Indian blood that they have that proves their belonging to an indigenous community. It basically dehumanizes indigenous people and equates them to animals because the only other species that use a blood measurement to understand like purity, which is an abstract concept in itself, is horses and dogs. And indigenous people are not horses or dogs, but you can see how that is dehumanizing in a sense. It's also devaluing because when you bring up questions about identity, you are also questioning the idea of value and worthiness. Like I had mentioned in the previous slides, this erodes tribal sovereignty. And in the first slide, this perpetuates white supremacy culture. How? In what ways? White supremacy culture and behaviors of perfectionism, individualism influence social impacts on a community. And so it leaves us with these ideas of shame and unworthiness. Like if we're less Oneida, if we're a quarter or a 12th Oneida, that somehow we're equating ourselves to being unworthy of connection to community, unworthy to our lineage, or unworthy to even our connections to language or culture, or speaking our language or culture. All of those things are interconnected. And so the idea of blood quantum has significant social impacts that cannot be measured by any number or data. So I'm always very adamant about getting people to understand that this is a story, it's a history, but also that identity is an emotion. It's a very spiritual aspect of our fire that we need to be incredibly mindful of and make shifts to understanding connection to community. The other social impacts include challenges and barriers to identity, including belonging or exclusion or lack of access, reconnecting with community. And so sometimes we think if we're less Oneida or a less amount of 100%, anything less than 100%, that we might be excluded and vice versa. Sometimes community does exclude people in that sense because it's not just a one-way thing. And it also sometimes results in a lack of access, unfortunately. It also fuels these stereotypes or misconceptions about scarcity and forces on this competition within communities with tribal communities for resources. So if a tribe opens up their blood quantum to be less than a quarter, the notion of competition comes about and says, well, then we're going to have to share resources. Resources mean money. There, it means there's less money per capita per person. And that is a hot topic when we talk about blood quantum. It reinforces individualism. We had mentioned this, and I think someone had mentioned this in the chat, that this idea of individualism is a key pillar of blood quantum. It was a key pillar of the Allotment Act and a key aspect of essentially the federal government's history with assimilating indigenous people. And that's a characteristic of white supremacy culture. It also prioritizes blood over language, culture, and responsibility as if more means more access to language or culture, which is not true. But these are the misconceptions that are part of the social impacts of understanding blood quantum in a community. So this also, unfortunately, often includes behaviors of what we understand to be lateral violence as an outcome of historical trauma. So I had mentioned the link between these high rates of substance abuse, domestic violence, incarceration, health, suicide. Those are behaviors that are outcomes of trauma. And even lateral violence, the way in which we relate to each other, whether that's either bullying or preventing exclusion or preventing access, excluding people, those are examples of lateral violence. And basically, that's caused by colonial violence because colonization is a cycle and violence is a cycle. Trauma and abuse is a cycle. And unless it's axed, unless it's disrupted, it will continue. And so it has continued to kind of filter down what I like to call the downward spiral into tribal communities. It also upholds this idea of Christian purity. And I know I'm kind of getting low on time, but I'm kind of getting near the end here. So thank you for staying with me here. Blood quantum, it upholds this Christian idea of purity. There is no such thing. Our people have been intermarrying and interconnecting with all tribes prior even to the prior to settler contact, prior to 1492. Especially the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee have been intermarrying and intermingling for thousands of years. And if you look within our cultural practices, we had adoption processes that existed prior to settler contact. So we also had protocol that said that the men would move in with the women into her longhouse. So if a Seneca man married an Oneida woman, that Seneca man would then go to Oneida and be a part of that community there. But it was never understood to be their children would be half Seneca, half Oneida. It was now understood that that family was Oneida because of the matrilineal lineage that they had, and vice versa. So there was always this fluidity. That's the important thing of it. But I always think it's really interesting because white supremacy culture talks about this idea of purity, and there is no such thing. So if we think about it in that same sense today, because sometimes tribes and discussions in tribes will say, well, if we just continue to reproduce with Oneidas, that might do something. Well, even the original roles that established however much Oneida you were during the Indian Reorganization Act period, those are also not accurate. So just because the United States wrote them down for tribes and said, here, you have to go by this, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily true because we never went by those standards. So it's just important to understand what these notions are that are presented in discussions like this. It also seeks to eliminate indigenous people and force their extinction. It's a way to take additional resources and land. That makes the United States no longer liable or have to fulfill trust and treaty responsibilities or obligations. Blood quantum is a measurement of ongoing assimilation. If tribes continue to stand by blood quantum, colonial blood quantum, they are participating and aiding the ongoing assimilation of indigenous people. So that's important to be aware of. Internal competition of resources and benefits. I had already mentioned this a little bit earlier. But the last one, it really threatens sovereignty and self-determination for indigenous people. So this presents moral dilemmas for us because we're literally questioning identity. Why is identity, worthiness, or belonging tied to enrollment or how much Oneida someone is? So this presents an idea or an issue that blood somehow equates to access, which is absolutely not true in our cultural ways. It's absolutely not right, according to our cultural ethical standards, I suppose you could say. And everyone that has a descendancy or a lineage has a right to language, culture, and all aspects of indigenous ways of being. And the other thing that I always say too is to ask how much Oneida someone is. It often evokes an emotion. And that's because we're questioning one's identity. We are essentially now equating identity to blood or identity to enrollment. But those two things are absolutely not in the same. But that's how we perceive them now because blood quantum is so normalized in our society and in our communities. So hopefully this teaching starts to kind of give you some clarity to kind of sift through the fog of how we operate in our communities today. It's really important because when we talk about blood quantum, it is an emotional conversation. And I think that we can learn as much as we want to about history, but we also really need to understand that we are a human being at the end of the day, and identity is the core of our existence. And we don't want to place a value on someone. That's a right of ours. It's an inherent human right that we have as part of creation because creation recognizes that in us, and we are also to do that with each other. And so these are really good considerations to reflect on for our teaching or kind of wrapping our teaching up. And so some of our pathways forward here. Where do we go with this information? Well, take this information to help you build awareness. Again, education builds awareness, and that's the first step to making social change, to movement building, to making change in our communities. Blood quantum, remember, blood quantum is a colonial box. It's a colonial framework. It restricts sovereignty. It is not ours. But the pathway forward is now that we know that, we have the opportunity to exercise our sovereignty and self-determination based on our cultural practices. And for Oneida people, that's based on our clan system or adoption processes, our connection with community, and that includes the responsibility of reciprocity. So we can reimagine identity through culture, kinship, and responsibility, and we can bring people together in ways we haven't before. And so I always like this graphic on the other side, which I showed in the last teaching too, but I'm going to apply it a little differently here, is these lines in this symbol, this symbol for Oneida people. And if you're familiar with any of the wampum belts, this bottom symbol here with the diamond and the two lines around it, that's one small piece of a larger wampum belt that is called the Oneida belt or the Six Nations belt. And it has a repeated pattern of six of these diamonds or rectangles that repeat in a pattern. And the original belt is in the Field Museum in Chicago. But I just took one of them to show you that the diamond, it represents our nation's fire as a community, but it can also represent our individual fire, our life force, our energy, our soul. The other outer line beyond the diamond, it represents our spirituality, our cultural practices, language, connection to creation. And the final outer line is basically like the shell of our being, our bodies. And so this can also be understood as our ancestral lineage or connection to community or identity, or how we might reconfigure or reimagine identity and belonging in a community using these wampum belts, using our clan lineage or clan understanding or adoption processes, because these are metaphors. These are guides and tools that we need to come up with a solution for problems that affect us today. We aren't out there right now floating on an island with no ideas. All the solutions are within our culture. We just need to look at those and say, how do we pull these forward? So that's the beauty of Oneida culture. So, looking at community-based solutions, we're really trying to center the story of our people, both individually and collectively. We want to prioritize the social impacts along with sovereignty. We want to be mindful of who and how we are showing up for community, how we determine what is community, who belongs to community, because that's all tied to identity and belonging. And remember, that's a reciprocal relationship. And also enacting our own sovereignty. We want to measure quality, not quantity. Remember, we don't want to measure identity based on blood quantum, like you're a quarter, okay, you have a free pass to get into the door of the nation now. We don't want to do that. We want to establish belonging based on a reciprocal relationship. So remember, our culture always has the frameworks. They've always had the frameworks and solutions to this problem or this dilemma that we face today. Clan system, lineage, adoption processes are considerations for this, solutions for this. The wampum belt symbol that I showed you on the last slide is also a consideration for a solution. And valuing relationship with community that is reciprocal from the self to the community to the universe is another consideration. So what can we do? We can speak the truth about the harms of blood quantum. We can refuse to let colonial measurements define our people. We can teach and live language and culture and responsibilities. A strong act of resistance is learning a language, is practicing culture, learning pottery, learning basketry, learning quill work, learning beadwork, reclaiming that, living that, embodying those cultural values. That is a strong act of resistance to colonial systems and frameworks like blood quantum. Um, we also want to build strong relationships with community. How do we do that? We do that through language and culture. We want to build leadership rooted in community, not numbers, not who gets the most votes. We want to be able to identify skill sets and foster and mentor those that truly embody leadership qualities in a cultural practice, embodying those cultural values, as opposed to profits or revenue or policy, which is basically how leadership is discussed today in a political organizational framework. So we're really reclaiming belonging as sovereignty and self-determination. So these are huge movements. Let's start with the self, that small seed, that center of the relationality, the web of relationality. So think about this as I leave you here today, and I went over a little bit, so I apologize. But just some reflections to sit with as we finish this teaching here today. So if you want to share, you can definitely, you're more than welcome to share in the chat, but I'll just kind of give you some questions to sit with. What stands out for you from this teaching? What questions does this raise for you? How can you stay curious to develop a deeper understanding about blood quantum? What will you carry forward from this teaching? How has blood quantum touched your life or family? And what does blood quantum mean outside of a quantum, what does belonging mean outside of a quantifiable measurement? So these are questions to sit with. Um, so feel free to add anything in the chat, but just some final thoughts. And I wanted to capture this quote by Dallas Goldtooth, who's he's a screenwriter, he's an actor if you've ever seen him on Res Dogs, but he's actually an activist as well. And he said that identity is born out of a relationship with community. And I like that because it highlights relationship, but also responsibility and reciprocity, and that determines belonging, however that means for whatever unique tribal nation that we belong to. So thank you so much again for attending this teach-in. It's all being recorded, so I post this. Actually, I'll post it by Friday. It might not be tomorrow, but it'll be available to rewatch or share on YouTube, and I will send it to anyone that registered. And also just highlight upcoming teach-in. We have two more in our series. The next one is in 2 weeks on October 15th, and the topic is very language focused. It's fluency versus proficiency. And so I'll present a discourse about quantity, quality, and the journey back to sustainable language reclamation. Again, all of this is frameworked, it's within the perspective of white supremacy culture and how we can kind of move through the society and the world we live in to really reclaim our original ways of being. So thank you so much for attending tonight's session. I hope you all have a great night, and I will see you at the next teaching. Thank you.
Tuango, Nankiwa.
Nagiba.